Hey everyone, and welcome to the Copilot Studio Dudecast. This is our first rendition of actually doing this, and so know that it'll probably get better over time, guys, because as you learn, you get more and more going on. But I wanted to kind of give you guys back something where it's less formal recording, more of me just kind of talking with some of my peers and people who are influential inside of the conversational AI space. And so I've got a whole host of different people that I'll be talking with throughout with the podcast. I might do some where it's just me kind of talking with you guys, but I've been trying to make sure that I get really good influential guests that can come in and talk to you guys that have been doing this kind of technology for a long time, which kind of leads me into who we're going to have on for the very first one, and who else to have on than Andy Matkin. Andy Matkin is been in this space forever. He was brought in from he's a Microsoft employee now, but he actually started as one of the guys that helped build out the Nuance mix implementations and things like that. So welcome to the show, Andy. And Andy, maybe give yourself a quick introduction to the people and kind of what you've been doing, where you're from, and kind of what you do now inside of Microsoft.
Sure. So Andy Matkin, nice to meet you all. I've been in this space for about 25 years. I started off as a consultant within a private company that was eventually bought by Nuance, building agents. Back then we called them bots, focused mostly on IVRs, which is interactive voice response, which is more speech related. So I built a lot of applications in the past for various retail banks in the U.S. And as part of that, I got into building frameworks and tools for creating these agents a little bit faster, a little bit easier. And then eventually we turned a lot of that tooling into, as Dwayne said, Nuance Mix. So I moved over to the R&D. So I was one of the co-founders for Nuance Mix, which was a competing product to Copilot Studio today. And now I've actually moved over as part of the acquisition, the Nuance acquisition with Microsoft, to the Copilot Studio team. And now I work within the engineering team to work with customers to ensure that we have the right type of features within the product. And if those features don't exist while they're trying to build their particular agents, we look for ways to work around to see if there's functionality that we can use to work around the features that might be a bit of a gap there. So that's currently kind of where I'm at, Dwayne.
Yeah, and so guys, like Andy and I tend to work together a lot. Like he works with me on the back end when we find like really interesting challenges and things like that, where we need to go do some discovery within the engineering on the back end of Copilot Studio. So you can kind of think, in my world, I'm over working with all these different customers that are some of the biggest and baddest customers. That's part of our CAT organization, or now it is, Andy, as of just recently, we are the Copilot Acceleration team inside of Microsoft. And so that's the new acronym for CAT. It used to be Customer Advocacy Team, which is still what we do. We advocate for the customers. We look for all the holes and the gaps within the product and everything. And so that's why I think a lot of you guys like to follow me, is because I actually typically run into these type of problems. I know what is kind of troubling a lot of the different enterprises. And Andy's kind of like my right-hand man over in engineering whenever we get into some of these things. And so example being, Andy, recently you've been working with me on some different initiatives, and I think one of the things that you ran into that was a common thing that Nuance used to do was financial services and things like that. So you had built like a sample implementation of like a whole API and things like that for financial institutions. Maybe kind of explain sort of what you built in that and how you built it for different demo purposes, so people can kind of understand what you did and why you kind of went about it that particular way. And anything that you have that you also want to throw in around voice and the impact of building it the way that you built it versus the way you might want to think about voice is kind of a cool thing that I know you have a lot of experience in.
Yeah, I mean, once I joined this team, I ultimately really wanted to test out various features, and I just use a lot of the scenarios that I used to build with the applications myself. And since I worked in the banking space, it would kind of came natural that I would actually use some of those scenarios um, to build it. And so what I did was I built a bunch of REST endpoints for things like basically just user account profile, where it would give you, a username, address, and a list of accounts, account types, nicknames, things like that. And then other APIs for account balance, lost stolen card, make payment, transaction history, transfer funds, all the typical retail banking things that you would do as a typical user. And then recently it was kind of cool. I can't remember the last conference. It was Build. Was it Build? Not
Y-
Ignite.
I-
Ignite.
Yeah, it was Build was the last one. Yeah.
Okay. I keep getting those screwed up.
We have an Ignite
But
coming up is the next one, and if you guys don't understand,
okay, yeah.
Andy and I have to go to so many of these that we just lose track of which is the next one. So
Yeah, I always lose track. And so as part of that, I wanted to test the functionality that was being added for Build. And one of the cool things was inline agents. Um, Inline agents, if you haven't looked at them, is basically a replacement to what I used to do, which is more topic based or intent based flows that are all rule based if condition logic. Now you can go into an inline agent and essentially describe what you want to do. And through with that description, you can also say, type of if else logic and tell what type of tools to use to kind of implement that various logic within the instructions themselves. And
and
we
you know
had a
what's funny
scenario
about
when I
this, Andy? You know what's funny about it
was
is as of last week, they finally came to remember we were always discussing whether it's inline or it's focused agent or child. So oddly enough, they actually settled on a name for this thing now. And so now for
okay,
all the listeners, just be aware that what we're talking about is this function called a child agent, not a connected agent, which is something very different. And so Andy on there was a part of that whole presentation, Andy, where I hear like you went and you did something and you were like, oh my God, that actually worked a lot better than I thought it would. So I'll hand it back over to you, but I want to make sure I clarified because
yeah,
all of this naming and branding, it's all like, I feel like it's a constant change for you and I. But yeah, we're talking about specifically what you'll hear everybody refer to as child agents if you're paying attention to Ignite this year or going to Power Platform Conference. But go ahead, Andy.
yeah. Well, and my problem is that like on the engineering side, I don't think I'm either not paying attention or I don't know that I have all the latest naming conventions. So yeah, you'll have to correct me on all this stuff. But yeah, so as part of the Nuance Mix team, we had I can't remember if it was part of it when we were still beta or like when we were first GA, but we had a customer that was a banking customer that had a very complex kind of flow, right? It was basically lost card, which is a typical business flow that you would have for a retail bank. And they had a very, very complex scenario that um, essentially drove all of my requirements for what I was trying to build in terms of from a mix perspective. And they were asking, can you implement this in mix? And needless to say, I could implement it, but I think it took me like 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks to implement it. And then we also had somebody on the research side build an NLU, and I took that scenario. That's been my scenario since pretty much the last 7 years. As like, if I can do this in an agent, I can pretty much do pretty much anything I've wanted to. Um, And so I took that scenario and I actually put it into, I've already forgotten the name of the agent, into my what's the name, Dwayne?
I
I already
think that
forgot the name.
I've been seeing it. If you guys run around there and see this, the person I saw demoing this was Dan Lewis just recently, and that was,
No,
for those that
no,
don't
the
know,
type
Dan
of
Lewis
agent.
is. Oh,
Sorry,
I thought the
the
name of it was
inline agent.
Penny.
No,
Oh,
I'm
it's
sorry.
called a
I'm talking
child
about
agent.
inline
So the
agent.
child agent, yeah.
Child agent,
So
yeah. So I created
yeah.
a child agent for Lost Card, and once I figured out how to actually do this, I was actually able to implement Lost Card in about a day. It took me about a day to kind of figure out what the instruction, how to create the instructions with the business rules. Um, and if you want, I can actually show it, but maybe we could table that if you want. But it was amazing how it actually plays about, and I'll describe some aspects of it. Where essentially up front as part of Lost Card, so if the bank, the typical bot will say, how can I help you today? And you say, I lost my card. And the first thing that typical banks would do would be to say, well, let's look at their profile and see which card they have, right? If you have one card, it's very easy because you only have one card that you don't have to disambiguate anything. Whereas if you have multiple cards, then you have to disambiguate, right? So in the instructions, I say, go get the user profile and check to see how many cards they have. And if they have more than one, and this is all in the instructions, if they have more than one, disambiguate based on the account type or not the account type, but the account number or the nickname of the card. So that was just simple instructions. Whereas typically, anybody who's implemented one of these, that's a lot of code that you have to write. So you have to
so
integrate to the back.
basically, so basically, what you're saying, Andy, is I call in. I've got, let's say, 5 credit cards with a particular bank. Let's say that I was working with Chase as an example as my credit card provider, and I've got 5 different ones. What you're talking about is trying to figure out, when I'm talking to it, figuring out which card I'm calling about, right? To figure out what you're trying to do. Like if I want to say I want to check the balance, you need to figure out, well, what card, and then how do I figure out which card and explain which card, right? Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And so in this scenario, we know that they lost the card. We have to just figure out, well, which card did you lose, right? And so you just, through just basic instructions, you say, use this data from this tool, which in this scenario, it was user profile, and then disambiguate the card, with the user, and then move on. And then you do the typical, okay, lock the card. And then once you've locked the card, you typically want to say, I'm going to ship you a new card, right? So first things you have to do is validate the address. So then I say in the instructions, confirm the address with the user. And then if that's not the right address, update the address. So I have like a change address tool if it's not the right address. So there's a lot of business logic that goes into these instructions, and it nailed it. Like it was absolutely awesome how quickly I was able to just change the instructions a little bit and have it call the right tool, use the right business logic without writing really any code.
So compare that to, you said before it would take you like 4 weeks to be able to do something like this.
Yeah,
And even that, I think you would even agree with me, it was probably pretty constrained on what it can do because it's still if then kind of statements and stuff like that. So
correct.
in
Yeah,
your mind, like how much quicker was it and how much better was it when you did it with child agents?
right. So, okay, so this might be a good scenario where we actually take a step back and actually talk about like historically how these things have worked. Um, so when I first started in the IVR space, everything was DTMF, right? Meaning you click numbers to select menu options, things like that.
I think that
And then
stands for dial tone uh, modular frequency or something like that, I think is what it stands for.
that
Basically, guys, if you
I
take a phone and you push 9 on the phone, it puts a specific tone out. Remember, if you recall, Andy, back in the day when we were probably much younger, I'm going to show my age here. There was people who
yeah
would hack like the phones on the side of the road where they would make a tone when you put the quarter in, and so people would record the sound of the tone of the quarter and play it through the phone. to make it sound like you're putting money in. And so this was like an old school hack back in the day. That's that's the DTMF. In a sense, actually happening over the phone. And that's the way the modem worked, if you think about it. It was the frequency of the sound that was actually what was
Exactly.
handling. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so back in the day, you'd have to enter through the numbers, your credit card number, the date, menu options, things like that. It's very annoying. Then came speech, but when you had speech, it was still very constrained. We had what was called grammars. So you would have very specific grammars that were trained for that specific question. You couldn't say anything out of scope, and that's when you get the "I'm sorry, I didn't understand that." That's where sort of those things came. And then you had
This is
natural
everybody's
language.
thinking. That's where everybody's thinking about screaming at your car, trying to get it to do what you want it to do. And
Yeah, me too. So then you had NLU, which is speech with more broadening the upfront menu. Because the typical menu before you had NLU, it was like for checking, press 1, for saving, press or say checking, press 1 or say checking, those types of things. But you really only had like 5 options, whereas an NLU really kind of flattens out the tree structure because you can have a lot more options up front. So an NLU really gets the intent of why are you calling, why are you doing this, and a lot of this translates to chat as well, because chat didn't really come out.
And I'll recommend people to know that there is a natural language understanding 101 thing that I put out a video on. It's an older video that I have, and this kind of explains NLU, or natural language understanding, for people. So if you're interested in like intent recognition and entity extraction, know that there's a video that kind of goes over that if you guys want to get more information on it. But that's kind of where Andy's talking about. This is where this all kind of started, where you didn't have to get the intent by the number that you were punching on the code, but it's the thing you said. You didn't have to say the exact words, but you had to say something kind of close to it, or you would end up with this other thing. And then you spent a lot of time, Andy, I know you and I spent a lot of time when you first came in having to migrate people. And when we were migrating people, having to get them to train their Nuance NLU to work with the Copilot Studio NLU, because they worked a little differently in the way that they ranked it. But a lot of this stuff worked where you would say something and it would have a ranking score, and then based upon the score, it would figure out whether or not you should go left or right. And if it was too close of a score, you'd have to disambiguate. And that's very different than what Andy's talking about now, which is kind of when you start using large language models. And so continue on with that, Andy, because it's kind of interesting that it's evolved in that space like this. It's kind of so much more accurate. But it's the training. You remember how much time we used to spend in training sets, and we don't even really think about that anymore.
Yeah, and the upfront, it was literally at the upfront menu. How can I help you? That's when typically the NLU was initially used, and then everything afterwards was similar to the directed dialogue that I just talked about before, which was individual grammars. And then we moved to where it was like NLU everywhere, which opens up a little bit more functionality in terms of conversational AI. So it could recognize a lot more. So if you're farther down in a menu and you say, actually, I want to make a payment, it would understand it because that NLU was actually activated pretty much everywhere within your flow. Now, so the reason why I'm talking about that is in the lost card scenario, I'll go back to the lost card scenario. The next thing that they had in the flow was after you kind of make sure your address is correct and they order a card, then typically you would look at the transactions, right? And this is the scenario that made things very difficult, which is, you would list out 5 transactions, and the customer that gave me the user scenarios, they were saying things like, the second one's not mine, or 1, 2, and 3 are mine, things like that. And so you can think about it from like if you've ever built an NLU, those are very complex things, because an NLU, you really have to train it on, this is what I expect the users to say, And then once you understand it from an NLU perspective, then you have to code what did they say and what does that mean and do anything with it. Whereas this was the exciting part for me around the LLMs is I don't have to train anything. And I literally just said, list all these transactions. I said, list these transactions. And I specifically had my API return more than 5 at a time. And I say, list them 5 at a time, loop through all of them, and make sure that those are their transactions. It's something along those lines. And I was able to say things like, the third one's not mine. And it would go and literally, it understood the third one, what the third one meant, right? Which if you've ever coded this, it's very, 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 very annoying to code. It understood it, and then it knew to call the API that the dispute transaction API. It actually did that, and then it got transactions again and just started looping through it. And since I said do it 5 at a time and be able to navigate, it went to the next 5 afterwards until you basically confirmed all the transactions. So just the amount, like I coded that in literally a day, and a lot of that was just me learning how these child agents actually work. Look at that, I remembered it. I remember the name. Anyway, a lot of it was just me learning how the child agents are supposed to work and understanding how different words inside of the prompt actually kind of give it better instructions, because I'm not really a prompt engineer. I've kind of learned things over time that just through testing, but I'm not exactly an expert on that. So it took me a day, and something like Lost Card, it took me in Mix, and I designed every aspect of the dialogue piece on Mix, and I own the runtime, and it took me probably 4 or 5 weeks to get it to work. I mean, a day versus 4 or 5 weeks. I mean, that's next level.
So, and not only that, you had the ability to say the first and the second one, the third and the fourth one, or the third and the fifth one, right? Or something like this. And doing that where you did like multi-intent understanding on top of just trying to get like the first one, the second one, the third one, and all of that, that was hard enough. And now, like, when we get into this, you don't, because it can understand the context of kind of what you're talking about and understand, it's not, because you remember, Andy, the other problem we had is that you'd have a whole conversation and you would just be analyzing what the person said. You don't necessarily have the context of the entirety of the conversation to figure out what we're talking about, which is, again, another thing that large language models brought into us to be able to do that. So I want to kind of switch the subject for just a second, because I know you and I have also, and this is like one of the hottest things going on, because I can look at the analytics on my videos and things like that. I know what people are talking about at our boot camps and everything. And one of the hottest topics is MCP, or Model Context Protocol. And I know you and I have been kind of working together on being able to start using this into Copilot Studio. And I think it's GA'd into Copilot Studio just recently. We added the ability to not just have tool support, but resource support. And I know you personally said, hey, I actually was really interested in this, and I'm going to go double click this a little bit. So I first start off with MCP, everyone should kind of be aware, this is where you're basically having a server that's going to explain how to consume like APIs and all these different things that are available to you, so that a model can understand it. So if you think about it, it's kind of like, I think the way they define it in some of our educational content is like it's the USB-C port that lets you plug in a third-party system into a conversational agent. But if you really look at it, it's a whole group of tools and resources and things that are available to you. That, imagine if I was ServiceNow as an example, or I was Salesforce or something like that, one of these third-party providers. The idea is that you used to have an API, and we could go connect to that, and then you've got to explain that API and understand the data structures and all that kind of craziness. Where the difference is, MCP is going to give them the ability to give you a model-aware version of that API, or a model-aware version of information that's in the system, that they are defining it for the system so that way you can just consume it and you don't have to do all this definition work. But I think, Andy, you found a lot of interesting things as you started to peel back the layer of the onion and going into MCP. Like there was specific things that you said you're seeing a lot of people do that maybe is bad practice. And while it kind of works, it kind of doesn't do what MCP is really intended for. Maybe you can kind of talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, and you're the one who actually asked me to look into MCP up front. That was kind of cool. That was the first time I heard about it, because you were asking if whether or not I could implement one. So I was like, I don't know. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I think, what was it, the National Park Service one that you and I have been working on trying to get that working?
Yeah,
And guys, you might end up seeing a demo of National Park Service scenarios. If you ever see that, or banking scenarios, or I think another one you're working on with me is retail and hospitality scenarios. Andy's the mastermind behind the scenes, building this stuff so that I can go figure out how to consume it. So just be aware that, you know, I just say that I get to be the lucky person to stand on the shoulders of giants. So therefore, Andy's one of those giants I get to stand on the shoulders of. So Andy, that whole thing, when you got in there, I know that you got really kind of frustrated because you were looking at these MCP servers and they were all these like ones people were building, and they weren't really doing what they were supposed to do, or they weren't working. It was like almost like someone who didn't fully understand how MCP worked created them, and as a result, it didn't really function the way you would hope it could function, or it doesn't function to the level of its opportunity to function. So I'll hand that to you.
Yeah, so let's start off with the cool thing about MCP, right, is it's a protocol. And as you mentioned, it's got tools, prompts, resources. Those are kind of the main things that it has, unless they're adding things so fast. I don't know that I keep up all that well. But the idea around the protocol is that when an agent connects, when you have it connect to an MCP server, there's an initialize method that returns the type of resources that this MCP server has. So if it has tools, it'll let it know. If it has prompts, it'll let it know. If it has resources, it'll let it know. And then if it has tools, it will call the list of get the list of tools, so that the agent actually knows what the tools are, knows what the prompts are, knows what the resources are, so that when you interact with the agent, it will know when to go use those various things, right? And the other cool thing,
and really quick, Andy, just so that we make sure that the people understand what we're talking about. So tools are going to be things like APIs, where resources are going to be things that are like knowledge information and things like that. And then if you go into prompts, if you're familiar with prompts, you can have like custom prompts that can be called, that can be used as well. In a sense, you kind of, in my mind, Andy, they're all kind of really just tools that it has at its disposal. It's just a classification of different tools that are available. And so when Andy's talking about that there's tools, resources, and there's prompts, and I think there's a new one called elicitations or whatever, but the point is, if you want to learn more about MCP, you can go look at it, but there's these different pieces that have to be supported. Right now, Copilot Studio supports tools and it supports resources as of last week, and so of the time of this recording. But just be aware, this is what Andy's talking about when he's talking about all of these things that are available to you. So again, Andy, going back into your part of it here, as you started peeling it back, you started to notice something about the way people were consuming it, and that's kind of a very interesting issue, is the way that the people who were building the MCP servers were just taking like an easy route and weren't actually optimizing or something of this nature, right?
Well, so I think it's just a matter of like trying to understand what is the goal of a tool. What are you trying to do with it? And a lot of people translated that to, well, okay, I have these APIs. I need to, if I'm going to build an agent that's going to interact with my system, I need it to be able to go to these APIs, right? So the example of like getting balance information, right? To get a balance information, you basically have to have the user ID and the bank account that you want to get that information from, right? Your typical REST API would have those two things, maybe some other things, but you would need like two pieces of information. Well, when you plug an agent to an MCP server, a lot of people were just creating a tool that basically was a wrapper to that REST endpoint, which is I need these two pieces of information. I'm going to call the REST endpoint and bring the information back, right? And then you leave the agent to deal with whatever comes, right? And so what a lot of people were doing is they're literally just wrapping their REST endpoint. That was it. All the examples that I saw, that's what people were doing. They're wrapping an endpoint and they're letting the agent kind of just do with the data whatever they want. But I don't know that a lot of people realize that you could actually give instructions, or you can give it additional information, or you could tell the agent go call another tool and do stuff with this information. So an example might be with just the simple example of calling get balance. You could say, if it's this type of an account, display, provide this information. If it's this type of account, provide that information. And you just put it in a prompt along with the data. So it's instructions to the agent on what to do with the response as well.
Okay, so think of it, so you're kind of saying the issue that you were seeing is people were just going, this is what this API does. They're giving an API and wrap the API, but they're not really taking advantage of the payload that's coming back or the output from the API having a definition. So if you guys think about Power Platform Connector, you have inputs and outputs, and you can do this on topics as well. And you have a definition or a model description that's happening on the inputs, and it almost be like people weren't giving a model description on the output and not understanding that in that description area in the MCP server, you could even give instructions on things. And an example of this is like in one of the videos I did on dynamic chaining, I showed how I could say in a topic, hey, I want you to do this to go, this thing goes and creates a PO, but I need to send it through the approval process once you create it. So just go ahead and send it through the approval. So I'm cross-referencing other tools that I can use to be able to go do this. And this is kind of what Andy's saying is the same thing, is that inside of MCP, a lot of people are defining their API and they're wrapping their API, but they're not actually taking full advantage of Model Context Protocol's ability to give additional information on how to display the data, how to format it, what are the things to do when you go and get this information, and what if I get this kind of information versus that information, it might change the way I want to do it. And so the power of it is really, honestly, Andy, that's kind of a big miss for a lot of MCP writers if you think about it, because if they did this right, you would get all kinds of great information. Like if we think about like a ServiceNow, for example, and an MCP server for it, you might get data back about assets or a incident that's an IT incident versus an HR incident. And you could actually explain inside of it that if the payload coming back is about assets, then do this with it, or format it like this. And if it's IT, like this, or HR, like that, right? And things of that nature. So I think this is a huge missed opportunity for the world to know that, hey, if you're building MCP servers, maybe you want to think about that at a different layer. And I know this is what I know you and I have been dealing with, which is consuming MCP servers can be a little more complicated because we're basically blindly just getting all the functions at runtime. So we don't really have the ability as the maker to override that. So we need to make sure that those instruction sets are great. So a bad MCP server is just not consumable in a great fashion. You'll also get kind of weird things that happen if people don't really define them well.
Yeah, you're leaving it up to the LLM to figure out what to do with that information if you don't give it a level of instruction. So yeah, and that's kind of what I've seen. I haven't seen, granted, I've been kind of heads down trying to implement something internally, but I haven't really seen any MCP servers that display that this type of functionality. There's a lot of articles out there now that are explaining how to do it. But I think translating it to your specific business use cases is not necessarily translating well to various people. And it probably all depends on, I've been in the conversational AI space, so I think more from the user perspective in a lot of ways. And it's like, what problem am I trying to solve with the user? And most people haven't really been in that space. So I think a lot of people are they're like, I have this endpoint. They're telling me I need an MCP server, so I'm going to wrap, these endpoints. But they don't understand that they don't have a conversational designer in front of this saying, how's this going to plug into an agent, and understand how that's actually should play out for the end user.
Yeah, and I would say, Andy, kind of as we kind of turn this into kind of our next subject, which is, how the world's changed with conversational apps. I think where we're starting to see is kind of what you're alluding to, is that a lot of what you need to think about when you're building all these different components and you're doing the prompt engineering is going to be that you need almost like a conversational designer aspect that's very different than the old conversational designer, who's thinking about the user experience and the behavior and the formatting and how you want all that to happen so that you can really do that prompt engineering capability. And so if we kind of think about that, can you kind of talk about, in your mind, how the world's changed in conversational apps? Because you've been at it from the very get-go, right? All the way down to punch 1 for this and punch 2 for this, all the way to now where we are, where it's we used to have someone who would design intents and come up with different ways and language models, and now you're in this whole new world, right? And just maybe kind of go on a bit here about how you've seen this change, and just maybe even the skill set change that you've seen happening within the industry.
Yeah, I mean, from a Nuance perspective, whenever I was involved, we had a speech scientist, like you said, that would train the ASR models and the NLU models. We had a UI designer that would work with the business folks to understand what are the rules, try to understand the persona that you're designing for your agent, whether it's a chat agent or an IVR agent. And then you had a whole boatload of people that had to implement the underlying technology, right? Whatever technology you're using. You had a whole bunch of developers that had to translate all of those rules into functional code. And I think now, given I'm kind of out of the space in terms of working on actual implementations, you really need people that understand your business to still work with somebody who knows how to design like a conversational agent. You need somebody, we used to call it user experience, right? So I don't know what you call that in a conversational, but somebody who's like a UX person that understands conversational AI. Those people need to kind of be the bridge between what the business wants and any of the technical aspects that you might have. But I don't see this huge engineering team or testing team that's going to be behind the scenes anymore. Because like I said, I mean, I implemented by myself, the lost card flow, that probably would have been, 8 to 10 people behind the scenes implementing that. If you're talking about the REST endpoints, the code that actually calls the REST endpoints, the NLU, any of those things, and tying it all together, that's a big production, and I just don't see it anymore. But you do need the business people to understand what are you trying to accomplish from a business perspective, because every business, if you think about just transfer funds, I worked with 5 different banks. I implemented transfer funds 5 different times. Each one had their own APIs, their own API design, their own business rules, what was valid, what wasn't valid. They had their own view of things. So you need to understand what are you trying to accomplish? How can you technically accomplish it? And then have a UI designer or a UX designer in there to understand, like, translate that for somebody on the technical side who's going to implement it within whatever, if you're in Copilot Studio, you got to figure out how you're going to translate that to functionality in Copilot Studio.
Yeah, and see, I think it's a good point because see, Andy, I'll give you a good story of kind of just yesterday for me, right? So yesterday, I'm working on building something out for an organization who's trying to they use SAP on the back end and Ariba, and what they're trying to do is not have like employees who are purchasing and all these different business units are purchasing stuff all the time, right? And so they have this whole procurement system. Well, the issue is to onboard a new vendor into procurement takes a ton of effort for an organization to go do that and sign up contracts and vendor relationship agreements and all this type of stuff. But this organization's got tons of vendors that are already in their vendor catalog, and they've got all these different assets that you could just go buy. The issue is discoverability of that and being able to understand that I'm
Yeah.
asking to go buy a new laptop. Well, most likely we already have a vendor that sells the laptop you want or something very similar to what you want. And so what they needed is a way to be able to figure this out, find it out of their different inventory of products in their pre-approved vendor catalog, and then surface that and allow someone to order it. The odd part about this, Andy, is to make it work and to get that working took probably like about 15 to 20 minutes. And most of that was me going, how am I going to consume the data? Or what's the
Yeah.
way to cache a copy of this data from the API so that I can get the data indexed and get that part? So that's the first step. But then where was the majority of the time? The majority of the time is what I refer to as kind of conversational design / prompt engineering kind of concept, which is basically tuning. And because I would get an answer, but I didn't like the answer, or if I asked it this way, it went the wrong way, or things like that. And so there's the getting it to orchestrate right. To me, that was step one. And then step two was, okay, now I need to make sure that it's formatting it properly in the response. And then I started working on chaining. Like, okay, I need to be able to find the thing that I'm looking for and make sure that it always finds the thing first and then it orders it. And here's the funny thing is we put in, because in our test data set, we were testing with some sort of gas. I'll just use acetylene as an example. And we only had one product in the product catalog data set that was acetylene. And so I said, I need to order some acetylene. And the large language model was too efficient. It literally dynamically changed, said there's only one in the catalog, and I just ordered it. And so it just
Right.
did
You're
it
like, whoa, whoa,
in
whoa,
one
calm
step.
down.
I'm
Yeah.
like, whoa, 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 hold on. I need you to confirm with the user before you just
Right.
place the order. And so this is an example of like the tuning and what Andy and I are talking about
Yeah.
it's not even
100%.
that the tech isn't got it right. And in that case, I needed it to go, hold on, you're smart, I get it, but there's a human here that you need to interact with to be able to do this. And this is part of the danger in my mind that people who aren't really experienced, they don't understand the tuning aspect and the importance of that and the amount of time it takes to do it because it's
Yeah.
sort of key.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a pretty important point. That's very different than what we used to do, right? When I did a demo of my banking application up front, I presented it at MPPC. I was being completely honest that I'm like, I'm going to try new things because the LLM can figure out things on its own now. And if you provide it the data, right, you provide it the tools, you provide it the data, it can do things on its own, which is very different than what I did before. I never tested anything that I didn't build into the system, right? In a rule-based system, it can only do X, Y, and Z if you've implemented that. You do anything outside of that, it will not do it. Now you kind of have to, as part of the prompt engineering, you have to engineer into it your business rules. It's like, I need a human to approve this or look at this or agree to it or things like that. So that's probably a different skill set than what we ever had before, because before, if you said something out of grammar or out that wasn't in the NLU, it just didn't get it. Or if you tried to go down a path and there was no rule for it, you can't do it. But the LLMs can actually do it now. They're smart. And, kind of give you a different example. I tried to implement my second MCP server after national parks was lost card. And so I basically did what everybody else did first, just kind of as I was learning. I just wrapped my REST endpoints and made an MCP server and then just started testing. And I said I lost my card. And the LLM just made up processes. I mean, it did some nice things. It locked the card. It looked at the API and it locked the card, right? Because the instructions of the Swagger file were good enough, so it locked it. Or not the Swagger file, but from the definition of the tool, right? It locked it, and then it ordered a new card. The next time I did it, it just like it was a different flow each time. It just made up business rules. And so what I realized is that like that's where I had to create a prompt that said, and I don't know that prompt is the right way to do it, but I used a prompt to do this. I basically created a prompt that said, if the user says lost card, these are the things you need to do in order, right? And I basically took the instructions of the child agent. I kind of replicated that in a prompt. Otherwise, you give it a bunch of tools, it's going to make use of the tools the way that it thinks that it should. So you're going to have to kind of pull it back a little bit and say, I want you to do this, but you got to do it this way. Otherwise, you could end up with some weirdness for sure.
Yeah, and you know what I think a lot of people will start to see is if you really break it down in Copilot Studio, there are areas in Copilot Studio that you're basically writing model descriptions to explain how you should orchestrate or what a tool does, right? And it's just a definition of what that tool is and how it should be thought of, right? Then you have others that are going to give you like instructions, like how it should behave, how it should be formatted, things of this nature. And there's all these different places, like there's instructions of how it should behave. Then you have formatting details where you can give a prompt information about how you want it formatted. And then you even have like when you get into child agents, it's really kind of cool, Andy, because I was playing with this in that scenario where the parent, you can explain this is the right tool to use when we're talking about this in the context of this, because I was building an employee assistant that procurement and ordering was a child of that, where HR with an HR agent and an IT agent, and being able to explain why, okay, I'm trying to order a computer doesn't go to the IT agent, it needs to go to the procurement agent. But then if you're looking for information about the product, maybe I want to go get information not in the product catalog. Maybe I also want to use manufacturers' websites and the support stuff for that device in a different place. And being able to get that right is sort of a combination of using each of them in different levels, because you have the top level that says, okay, when do I want to hand? And then you have the next level, which is how do I want to use, how do I want to format, and all of that. So to me, I really honestly think, and I think you can attest to this as well, what I'm finding is that it's less science, it's more art.
Yeah, and that's where, and I was going to touch on this before when you were talking about what you were doing. You kind of understand the business side of things, right? In talking to customers, and you understand the technical of how our product works and how to kind of pull functionality together to build something, right? And you also are a person who just naturally understands how it should interact with the user, right? So you're actually playing like three roles as an individual building this thing. And I don't know that everybody's going to be able to do that, and that's why I kind of distinguish. It's like, understand the business flow. Somebody on the business side needs to understand, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish, right? What are we trying to automate? What are the technical things of how that's actually done? Because a business person typically never understands that. And the technical person never understands the business. They just implement various pieces of technical whatever. And a lot of times it's different teams. You have one team that's implementing one API, you have another team that's implementing another API. They don't necessarily understand how the business is using it, right? And then you've got somebody who is on the front end who's building the actual user experience, right? And you played all three roles. And so that's the part that's going to be hard, is understanding. And potentially now you're probably going to have like a prompt engineer who who kind of sits in the middle is like, okay, this is how it's supposed to work with the user. If you want that, I'm going to have to inject these types of prompts to prevent what I call craziness, right? From an
Yeah.
LLM perspective.
So a couple of things I'll hit on here is this is where you will hear me talk about this. If any of you guys have ever heard me speak in public and stuff like that, you'll know that I like to say that Copilot Studio is basically a kitchen full of tools and ingredients. And you can take eggs and flour and different things inside your kitchen and make different recipes with the same ingredients that are different things. And so the question becomes, and this is where it gets really interesting, and is you're kind of doing a combination of, well, what is the right mixture? What is the right baking? Or am I going to cook it? How am I going to apply all of these things to get different things from the same set of base tools? And so that's kind of what Copilot Studio is in its sense. And this is kind of that role that you have to learn how to get into. And I won't lie, I'll give you guys a little secret for me. When it comes to prompt engineering, I won't say that I'm the best prompt engineer or prompt writer in the world, because that's just not where I grew up, and it's not necessarily the greatest thing for me. But what I found that can help me become better is when there's something called the CARE framework that you'll hear me talk about a bit. I think that's actually a pretty good framework. It's easy to understand, so you should go check that out. And then the other thing is inside of the M365 Copilot that many of you probably have access to, there's the ability to create an agent in the Copilot Studio Lite experience, and there's a template called Prompt Coach. And I use that all the time to say, hey, help me make this better, or here, this is what I'm trying to do. Give me a starter prompt to help me get started, and then I can tweak it and tune it from there for what I need. Now, these are just some of the tricks that I have, but there are a lot of cool stuff that's sort of coming. Now, we can't talk about things that aren't announced or anything of that nature, so we're going to kind of just talk about, in general, excitement, areas that, Andy, that you're seeing happening within the industry. What are some of the things that are coming up that are starting to come about? Like, I know A2A is starting to get some attention. There's a lot of other things that are starting to get attention. What are some of the things that you really see that the future's bright for, or you're excited about it coming?
I think the agents that are running autonomously, I think will be very interesting. And what I mean by that is I've been one of my tasks within my team is to really try not to code anymore, and use GitHub Copilot within Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, which if you haven't played with it, it's really quite nice. And then obviously I led a large engineering team, and so it was very easy for me to get things done because I just delegated work to the team. I didn't really code anymore for the longest time. And I think what will be very interesting is having agents that you give it some instruction and it just goes off and does a whole bunch of work on its own. It doesn't come back to you every single time. Right now in Visual Studio Code, I say I want to do X, and it'll do X, and then it's done. And I have to tell it like everything. And I'm just wondering, or I'm excited about the potential to say, I want to build this REST endpoint. It's got to have X, Y, and Z. You have to do whatever. And it just goes and builds everything behind the scenes. And I want to be able to do that with as many agents as I can think of ideas. I think that will be the most interesting. I don't know how that translates to like a business, in the space that I typically did, right? Because when I was building this, the whole idea is you want to automate things for a user so that they're not having to talk to people. One, it's time consuming, and two, from a business perspective, it's very expensive, right? Like, how does that translate to like businesses behind the scenes? But like having agents that actually just perform on their own without hardly any human interaction, right? Kind of like, basically the way I see it is like the way you described it before, a human in a loop. Like, I only want to be when I have to be there. That's all I want to do. And those are the things that I'm excited about. because then we
Yeah,
can
go
just
do the
proceed.
work and let me just confirm that it's good or give you some guidance,
Yeah,
and then you can go back and
yeah,
keep doing it. It's someone, I was in a executive briefing not too long ago, and I had someone coming in talking about frontier firm. And for those of you that don't know, Microsoft has got this definition of frontier firm that is like how your company's performing along the process of becoming an AI and like powered organization. And the way they kind of talked about the future of a human in this function is that everyone's a manager. And the question is, the
yeah,
manager decides when to hire or write job descriptions and things like that, and then validate the work of the team, right? And so if you start thinking about it, I think there's a lot of angst in the world on people thinking, oh, AI is going to take over the world. I don't necessarily think in that same manner. I think that what you're going to see is that the things that are hard to get people to do, it's really hard to get people to do first line contact center scenarios, right? We can't even if you had a job, finding people that would do that job and stay in that job is almost impossible in this day and age. And so there are these type of roles and these things like this where imagine I'm managing that. You can even think about the fact that today, like I went to Taco Bell the other day and I needed to order some food. And I didn't talk to a human, I just did it at a kiosk. So I think that kiosk evolves, but that's the same as a person who took an order. It's just a different that you can turn that into a conversational application where you're just talking to it versus having to click buttons. And I mean, I wanted my soft taco to not have lettuce and to be
yeah,
grilled chicken instead of beef. And I had to do that for all three of them in the combo meal. And it's so annoying, Andy. All I want to be able to do is say, remove the lettuce and convert it and switch it to chicken and for
right.
all of my soft tacos. And and it should freaking do it, right? Versus it's like 16 clicks to do this in this thing. And not that I'm complaining, because at least whenever it comes out of the kitchen, I don't have to worry about that person punch the right buttons on the screen. And so I feel like what you see there is it goes and collects that information, and then you get that confirmation as the human, and you go, yeah, that's right. Because all of us have stood at the drive-through and seen the drive-through with the thing that says, here's your confirmation. So just think about it that human confirmation always needs to be part of it. But then there's also the fact that we are all going to become, in a sense, in my mind, we're all going to become managers of these little things doing all that work. And it's no different than you thinking about the little Roomba bot that runs around and cleans your floors. You don't have to necessarily vacuum or whatever, but it may not do the highest quality job. There's going to be places where you have to go and take care of it. And when it gets stuck on the carpet in that same spot every time, you're going to have to go take care of that. Again, they'll get better over time, but that's kind of the view that I think we've been kind of thinking about is don't think about it that you have to go do these remedial things. It's going to be, you're going to be the manager of this, which I think will be much more rewarding, and people will be able to get a lot more done because they don't have to go do all of the minuscule work that needs to be done in order to be able to, actually get a lot of value. And I think a lot of people are going to find that a lot more rewarding than they think about it today. But that's kind of my view of it. So with that, I want to talk about one last thing really quick. We'll spend a few minutes on this, and that is there are some conferences coming up where you can come and see me and Andy. There's one in Orlando coming up, and it's the week of. Let me look here really quick, Andy. I think it's pretty much. Let's see. The week of, I'm going to be out there starting on the 19th through the 23rd, and then
Yeah,
which is going to be in Orlando, Florida, at the Gaylord Palms with the North America Summit, which is nasummit.com. Andy's going to be there with me, and he's going to be presenting, and we're going to co-present as well. And so I think we're both really excited about Orlando. That's going to be fun.
yeah, that should be
How
good.
about you? Yeah,
Oh yeah, I'm
and
definitely
Andy,
excited. I haven't been to
yeah,
Orlando.
so they've convinced me to enter the pickleball tournament. So you guys need to in the chat and everything. I'll leave comments on so you can all encourage Andy to come and play pickleball. Apparently, it's going to be in the middle of the showroom floor. It's going to be pretty cool, and everything. So, as you guys can tell, Andy's sport of choice, so you guys know, is fly fishing. So if there's fly fishing and standing in a bunch of water and catching fish, that's Andy's jam. But then after that, the week following, I'm going to be at the Power Platform Conference, and a lot of different stuff's going on there. I'll definitely be at the booth for that. Andy, will you be at the Power Platform Conference by any chance?
Currently, I'm not there.
Okay.
As far as I know, I have not been invited.
Okay. So. And then I think Andy and I are both. The problem is that as you get in further into like Ignite and stuff like that, I would say there's a probable chance that we'll be there. I don't know yet. We'll stay tuned to the channel and stuff, and we'll let you know. Like if I'll be able to make it. I know Andy, you and I were talking earlier, and we're still trying to figure out who all's got to be there to cover it, because guys, just those events happen, and then there's also got to be people back at the home office making sure all this stuff's working, making sure our customers aren't falling down, and especially when all these new features come out. Like I think there was a feature that we released at one event, and we didn't realize how popular it was going to be. And by the end of the presentation, all the capacity for the GPU that we had allocated was completely gone. And we were actually having production issues because so many people wanted to go play with it. And so we had to go in and do some stuff. So there's a lot of kind of stuff that sometimes we have to do. It's really kind of funny if you think about it. But if they don't have an opportunity to see you at North America Summit, is there any place where they can go to be able to connect with you outside of those events?
Probably the best place is LinkedIn. Just ping me through LinkedIn, shoot me a message, and we can go from there.
Well, that's great. And same with me, guys. You can go to CopilotStudioDude.com. That'll get you to the YouTube channel that I run. Also, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I apologize, guys. I do batch up connections, and I try my best to respond to comments and to requests that come in through that. I just kind of have to batch them because there's so much that comes at me between my day job doing Copilot Studio Dude, which isn't my day job. Andy will attest that this is something I do above and beyond my normal day job. I think it's because I'm a masochist, Andy. I just like to be abused.
I'm 100% positive on that. So okay.
And so definitely, I hope you guys, this is our first podcast. I'm definitely interested. Go in the comments, give us some recommendations, some things of that nature. I'll do my best to accommodate those different things. I am not displacing the video content with the podcast. I'm going to continue to do this. You guys are going to see that what I've been busy working on, and the reason you might have seen a little bit of a slowdown is a couple of things. One, I've been traveling quite extensively for work, as well as fall break for my kids, and I'm trying to make sure I spend time with them. But the other part is I've been lining up different people for the podcast, and so I have got numerous really influential people inside of Copilot Studio and Conversational AI that'll be coming in and talking with you guys and such. So definitely make sure that you subscribe to the podcast if you're interested in this. And again, I'm always open to some feedback. And I'll always leave you with, if you want to go out and you want to try Copilot Studio, you can do that at aka.ms/try Copilot Studio. And again, you guys have a great one. Thanks for the 10,000 subscribers. I really appreciate that on the YouTube channel, and I hope that we can get 10,000 more. I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can do for you guys, and I have some things I'm working on this weekend that I'm hoping to get done at the time of this recording. I'm hoping to get those things done for you guys because I found some really cool new stuff, and there is some really cool stuff coming for PPC or Power Platform Conference and Ignite. So if you aren't planning on going to those events, or you're not going to be showing up or in person, you need to go make sure that you come up with a way to get the information about the about what's going on. And a good way to do that is, of course, I'm going to make sure that you guys know all the big things. But if you have the opportunity to start following that, do that. And also be aware that there is also the PowerCat webinars or the CAT webinars now. I am a frequent guest on those as well. So you guys definitely go and do that, and look forward to seeing you more as we go. I hope you guys enjoyed the first one of these, and I hope there's many more to come. Andy, thank you so much for coming out and participating. You were the honorary first guest because you and I were like, okay, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to give it a shot.
Well, the good thing is it can only get better from here, right?
Oh, Andy, that's Andy's joke, guys. So Andy says,
Yeah.
well, at least you started the bar low with your guest, and I wouldn't say that. Andy is amazing, and he's got a really good background on this. So you guys make sure you go follow him. And again, thanks again. You guys have a great day.